Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. I'm Tracy Farmer, and on behalf of the International Literacy Educators Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar tonight. As a housekeeping note, I will be dropping the PowerPoint into the chat a few times this evening so that you'll have access to it. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Catherine Compton-Lilly as tonight's presenter. Dr. Compton-Lilly is the John C. Hungerpiller Professor at the University of South Carolina, and she holds emeritus status at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is also the author or editor of 8 books and over 60 peer-reviewed articles in book chapters. Dr. Compton-Lilly's passions are helping teachers support children in learning to read and write and serving children from historically underserved communities. Last year, Dr. Compton-Lilly was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame as I get tongue twisted. So thank you, Dr. Compton-Lilly, for sharing with us tonight. Centering readers means centering equity.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Andrew, for having me here. And thank you to all for being here such late in the evening. I know I just finished teaching my class, and I know that these nights are precious, and so I'm very grateful for you all to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces or familiar names that are showing up. So hello to all my friends that are out there. It's nice to be with you in this kind of weird virtual world. Across my presentation today, hang on. Okay. Across my presentation today, I pose a particular question that has haunted me since my early years as a teacher. In my 18 years of public school teaching, I worked in what we used to call inner city schools, and they were located in an African American community. As a teacher, I struggled to understand why so many smart, creative, and charming children struggled to learn to read. And after completing my EDD, I continued to teach for 5 years, hoping that I would be better prepared to serve the children. Sometimes I was successful, but not always. Notably and unfortunately, the challenges I face as a teacher continue to be replicated across North American schools and have been part of our educational legacy since schools first operated in our continent. Specifically, if the greatest challenge historically facing North American educators is serving all children equitably, how can a single approach to teaching reading be the solution for children from a vast range of cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, neurological, and experiential backgrounds? Today, I argue that there are many forms of difference, and all these forms of difference matter for emerging readers, and that it's absolutely essential that we see these differences and learn how they impact reading and readers. This is a first step in learning how to draw on the strengths that all children bring to classrooms. Central to my argument is a classic distinction often made between equality and equity. In short, equality means that everyone is treated in the same way, regardless of a person's needs or other individual differences. Equity means providing everyone with resources specific to their needs in order to make each of them successful. To illustrate this distinction, scholars and educators have shared variations of this image. In the equality images, all people are provided with the same resources. But in the equity images, people are centered and different people are provided with different resources depending on what enables them to achieve the goal. In classrooms designed around equity, everyone is treated the exact same way, regardless of needs and differences. However, in child-centered approaches, children are recognized as having unique needs and the right to responsive instructional approaches that draw on careful observation and analyses of children's reading and writing behaviors. While science of reading advocates often argue that providing children with the same foundation in phonics and phonemic awareness will even the playing field, this ignores differences that have plagued North American education and denies the impact of systemic injustices faced by children, families, and communities. Notably, I am not dismissing research on how children learn to decode or quantitative studies that document the effects of reading interventions. These studies provide important information about how children negotiate particular dimensions of reading. However, based on a range of studies that recognize differences, they are not complete. Recognizing that scientific investigations surrounding reading are vast and multidimensional, I challenge descriptions of the science of reading that present exaggerated, misleading, and at worst false claims promoted by media and a small group of scholars and educational activists, publishers, and journalists. These policies, practices, and claims are dangerous because they deny the diversity of children served in North American classrooms. These claims are impacting educational policy, limiting how teachers can respond to individual children, which is devastating for children who have been historically underserved by mainstream educational systems. Today, I introduce you to 8 children who are different in ways that are characteristic of all humans. Their personalities, motivations, interests, passions, propensities, and dispositions characterize the vast range of humanity. While these children are not real, they really are in our schools and classrooms. The children I describe today are composites of many children that you and I have taught. Some participated in research projects that have been conducted, that I have conducted, and none were created from scratch. In addition, their differences are well documented in research, which has consistently confirmed that many forms of difference matter as children learn to read. These differences include developmental differences, racial differences, socioeconomic differences, linguistic differences, cultural differences, physical differences, neurological differences, and human differences. To explore these dimensions of difference, I will introduce one student and briefly discuss research that documents how this type of difference affects learning to read, and examples of these differences and how they play out in classrooms will be shared. Developmental differences. Cindy is a tiny child generally found at the edge of classroom activity. She is sweet, quiet, a first-grade student. She never disrupts class, but requires extra attention to ensure that she participates fully. She often needs extra help in getting started with activities and understanding instructions. Some tasks are difficult for her. If frustrated, she will stop and sit quietly. Cindy has a late birthday and is almost a year younger than the eldest children in her class. When speaking, Cindy often misarticulates sounds, switching d for th and b for v. These misarticulations are sometimes reflected in her writing. Her handwriting is less controlled than that of the other children, and she seems aware of this. She spends significant amounts of time trying to erase what she has written, sometimes giving up and staring into space. Her drawings are characterized by floating objects with no horizons. When she can, she avoids writing and drawing tasks altogether. To be clear, Cindy does not have particular learning difficulties, and she is making progress with reading. She's just moving more slowly and seems younger and less mature than her peers. The significance of developmental differences has long been recognized in reading and writing research. In the decades leading up to the 1970s, there was extensive discussion about reading readiness. Sense scholars, including Jean Shaw at Harvard, proposed stage models of reading and identified particular points in time when reading shifts from learning to read to reading to learn, and identified what is now known as the 4th grade slump. However, even as Shaw proposed this age-based and relatively static model, other scholars, including Mari Clay, were contributing to emergent models of reading and writing that reveal the different patterns and rates of children's learning. While individual trajectories often fit these general patterns, scholars documented varied learning trajectories that are responsive to the various particular literacy experiences and propensities that children brought to texts and stories. Just as many children learn to speak at different ages and are toilet trained at different times, children like Cindy vary in regard to when they become readers. Developmental variation is widely recognized as central to the human condition. The significance of developmental diversity is so well established that even AI was able to produce what I consider a highly accurate gloss. While I've never before used AI for any scholarly purpose other than spell check and grammatical editing, I offer it here. Developmental variation refers to the natural range of differences in how individuals develop across various aspects of their life, including physical, cognitive, and social abilities, essentially signifying that not everyone develops at the same pace or in the same way, and that this is considered a normal part of the human condition. It encompasses the idea that diverse developmental trajectories are inherent to human development and should not be automatically viewed as a disorder unless significant functional impairments are present. Racial differences. Keisha is an African-American 3rd grader. As her portrait suggests, she is outgoing and a happy child, always willing to engage with others. She finds humor in the daily activities of school. While her willingness to engage is clearly an asset, her questions and comments sometimes make her teacher uncomfortable. During a reading lesson, she asked, "Why are all the people in this book white?" And when she saw a picture of a suburban home with a white picket fence and carefully trimmed hedges, she commented, "My house isn't like that. Rich people must live there." Over time, her questions became more poignant and more sophisticated, asking things like, "Why did they shoot Dr. King?" Over time, Keisha became increasingly wary of her teachers and less willing to engage in instructional activities that she viewed as pointless. She often reported that the books she read in school were boring. However, when Keisha encountered meaningful texts, she beamed, returning to those texts repeatedly and incorporating them into her own writing. The same week her teacher read the book I Am Enough to the class, it showed up in her name poem and in her desk, literally and physically hidden in her desk. Keisha was aware. She noticed when she was included and when she was overlooked, and this affected her reading experiences in the classroom. The significance of race relative to learning to read has been documented by researchers for decades. 45 years ago, reflective teachers were considering race, often awkwardly betraying the assumptions and stereotypes that they brought to their classrooms. Increasingly, these early attempts shifted to intentional efforts to highlight the strengths and abilities that children brought. Dyson recognized the need to attend to children's experiences, while Mohammed reported on the wealth of literate activity that resulted when students were invited to draw on literacy practices from their communities. Finally, scholars have also recognized how literacy assessments and other standardized instruments fail to adequately honor the abilities of African American children. Importantly, the effects of race and reading achievement are not related to cognitive or intellectual deficiencies. Instead, as Johnson and Scanlon reported, higher rates of reading difficulty in racially different families are related to a history of schooling in impoverished conditions, with fewer family opportunities to acquire the foundations of literacy. Richard Milner questioned whose voices have contributed to the science of reading and who has disseminated this information about learning to read. He asked, who builds this scientific evidence, and how might that evidence be enhanced by a more racially diverse cadre of researchers? What science is missed, ignored, overlooked, underexplored, misinterpreted, overgeneralized, and undernuanced about reading, when knowledge construction is not diverse and representation of the varied racial identities of students under study are not considered? While recognizing the affordances of qualitative studies for sorting and tracking students over time, Milner argued that for qualitative accounts that document, he argued for qualitative accounts that document aspects of reading and learning that are difficult to measure. And he systematically contributed to, we need to systematically contribute to what we know about reading comprehension and development. Qualitative research allows us to hear stories of children like Keisha. Socioeconomic differences. Gabby is also a first grade student. She lives with her mother, who is physically disabled, and her brothers. Due to her mother's disabling condition, her mother rarely works, and they rely on social services and contributions from her eldest brother's part-time job for income. Gabby spends most of her time in the apartment with her mother when she's not at school. She helps to take care of her younger brother. The family moves every few months as they struggle to pay the rent and continuously seek more economical housing. There are few children's books in the household, and the books that Gabby shows me are dated and appear to be library discards. Her mother walks her to school early every day so that she can partake in the school breakfast program. At school, Gabby consistently sports sweatpants and hand-me-down shirts from her brothers. She comments on the frills and fashions worn by the other girls in her class, saying, "I don't do pink. I'm more an action person." Gabby is more comfortable interacting with the boys in her class. She dismisses many of the children's books shared by her teacher and enjoyed by her peers, calling them silly and boring. As she reported, "I only like books about animals and real stuff." When asked about her favorite book, she either shrugged or spoke about the photographs in the nonfiction books that she perused during independent reading time. As we know, the 1960s were marked by social unrest and increased attention to equity, as reflected in Johnson's War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Movement, and the integration of schools. It was during this time that reading scholars turned their attention to how socioeconomic status affects learning to read. Despite this attention, correlations between social class and academic underachievement had continued. Shaw and her colleagues sought to explain why poor children fall behind in reading. They compared above and below level readers to family home data, classroom observations, and teacher interviews. They surmised that with responsive instruction, the fourth grade slump could be avoided for children from low socioeconomic families. They maintained that effective reading programs incorporated adjustments to the needs of different children, including gifted children, low achievers, average students, and second language learners. At the same time, other scholars were using ethnographic methods to describe the various literacy practices occurring in the homes of children from different backgrounds. These case studies provided detailed accounts of how socioeconomic difference affects families and children in terms of neighborhood characteristics like safety, resources, and educational opportunities, and family stressors such as gainful unemployment and stable housing. Despite these challenges, these studies documented the strengths and knowledge possessed by members of low-income families and revealed the efforts that parents make to support their children as readers, writers, and learners. The significance of socioeconomic difference is ignored or perhaps denied when the context in which Gabby has lived since birth is not recognized. Struggles to provide food, shelter, and resources are real and have real effects on children in terms of nutrition and a sense of safety, valuing oneself as a member of the school community, which involves ways of dressing, talking, and valuing. As Taylor and Dorsey Gaines reported, problems arise when we ignore the social processes of contextual tying, how context affects children, and we take our traditional ways of thinking about literacy, the rigid hierarchies and taxonomies and predetermined sets of skills that we create, and place them in classrooms for children to learn. Linguistic differences. Carlos is lucky. He has spent 3 years in a Spanish-English bilingual classroom with an excellent teacher who not only speaks both Spanish and English, but is also intentional in helping children to recognize and wonder at the differences between the two languages. Highlights of my visits to Carlos's classrooms featured talk about cognates, differences between English and Spanish grammar, and laughter as the students identified idioms in the two languages. Carlos has made great progress with learning to read in both languages. Although he progressed more quickly in Spanish, his English reading caught up by grade 5, and his teacher considered him fully bilingual and biliterate. Talk about language was ubiquitous in Carlos's classroom. These connections built on the important bilingual knowledge of students and their growing metalinguistic awareness. For example, during morning meeting, Carlos's teacher invited the students to consider the following idiom in English. You can't put lipstick on a pig, noting that it meant that some things are just not attractive no matter what you do. She then compared this idiom to an idiom in Spanish, which goes, even if the monkey dresses in silk, she's still a monkey, noting its similar meaning. The children laughed at the two expressions and offered similar sayings in both languages. Across my visits, I often heard language comments, including things like, do you know a word like that in Spanish? What sound does J make in Spanish? What about in English? Does that sound right in English? Is there another way to say that? What's the meaning of that word in Spanish? What about in English? Are they the same? Reading research has clearly demonstrated that language differences play a critical role in learning to read. Starting with early studies that explore differences between how people learn informal versus academic English, Krashen explored the different ways literacy and language were practiced. Krashen explored differences in informal versus academic English, while Heath explored researchers and practitioners and the different ways literacy has been practiced in different communities. In addition, researchers and practitioners have increasingly recognized the linguistic strengths that multilingual children bring to classrooms. These studies have described the contributions that first language knowledge can play not only in learning a second language, but also in learning to read in a second language. Teacher qualifications for working with multilingual students, the need for schools and teachers to collaborate with families, and the instructional responsivity to cultural and linguistic backgrounds of students were identified as critical. Norguru and Lee challenged the effectiveness of science of reading for bilingual and multilingual children. By documenting the miscues and retellings of bilingual children, she analyzed their translanguaging practices, describing their language approximations as agental, intelligent, and creative. She highlighted the abilities of bilingual, biliterate children as they learn to negotiate different ways of marking verb tense and making meaning across languages. As she noted, few studies referenced by science of reading advocates involve emergent bilingual children or attend to the unique demands of learning to read in a new or additional language. David Scher worried that the science of reading was only a science of reading in English. As he noted, the field cannot indiscriminately generalize theories and findings to other languages and writing systems. Current frameworks for conceptualizing the challenge of learning to read across languages and orthographies provide valuable insight into only one essential facet of a complex, multifaceted mosaic that is learning to read. Consideration of the complete picture of the world's writing systems reveals multiple dimensions of orthographic complexity, each liable to create obstacles for students learning to read and write. Furthermore, each of these dimensions has direct implications for practical issues such as assessment, the diagnosis of difficulties, instruction, and intervention. Cultural differences. When asked to draw a portrait at age 6, a self-portrait, Adam drew himself in sunny Morocco. He wrote about his picture, "I am looking at the sky, and I made a smile in Eid, and I am happy in Eid." Across our interviews, Adam often spoke about his Muslim religion, being careful to remind me that the vast majority of Muslim people are peaceful. Most of his teachers were not aware of his Muslim faith or his ability to read, write, and speak in Arabic. When he was in 3rd grade, Adam showed me the app that he was using to memorize passages from the Quran. At age 9, he surprised me by correctly reading cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, on a map that he drew of his school. My surprise shifted to understanding when I realized that awareness of directionality was essential for Muslim people so that they could direct their prayers to Mecca each day. Adam spoke about some of the children at his school, saying, "People don't understand. Like, I'm walking around the hall and I just hear people saying stuff like they don't even know what it means. Like they're just yelling like Allahu." And I'm like, "Do you even know what that means?" And my friends are like, "Oh, it's something terrorists say." And I'm like, "That's not what it means at all. It's what we say in prayer. It means God is great. It is not something you say to spread hate or fear. It's something like praise Jesus Christ." In my ongoing review of historical documents related to literacy, in the 1960s, it was not unusual to encounter references that presented cultural differences as problems. Research reports were filled with references to cultural deprivation, culturally deprived children, culturally disadvantaged homes, and cultural problems in classrooms. Successful students were often described as having been successfully acculturated into school. Since then, researchers have documented the funds of knowledge, cultural resources that children bring to school from homes and communities. For example, focusing on multicultural and multilingual neighborhoods of London, Gregory documented the literacy practices of children and families. She dispelled myths that characterize immigrant communities as non-literate, highlighting the involvement of parents and children in children's literacy activities and the potential of these literacies to inform school learning, noting that there's not one method of becoming literate. Across this body of scholarship, the significance of culture for how people approach texts and make sense of texts has been documented. For example, Skirrett reported, "There is wide recognition of sociocultural theory as a relevance-based framework for teaching and learning. This assertion holds for socioculturally based approaches to reading education for all students, especially those from culturally and linguistically minoritized groups. Culturally and linguistically diverse students will continue having difficulties developing and demonstrating their reading competencies, including on standardized curriculum and assessments when it fails to account for sociocultural differences." Physical differences. Lana is 6 years old. She has significant hearing loss and thus sometimes receives instructional support from a deaf education specialist. At other times, she receives help from a paraprofessional. Lana has been using sign language with her deaf parents since birth and uses sign language to read. Given her hearing issues, learning to read through phonics is complicated because she can't hear the sounds articulated by her classroom teacher. However, the deaf education specialist is not always available to provide signed interpretation. The materials her teacher has access to and the activities that are mandated by the state and school district do not accommodate Lana. Thus, Lana often spends time drawing, looking at books, and doing activities on her iPad, while the other children complete their daily phonics and phonemic awareness activities. Regardless, somehow, and to her teacher's surprise, Lana is learning to read. While Lana was doing well with reading, she is among the minority of deaf children who become strong readers. Among signing deaf children like Lana, only 22% of children are average readers, with 52% being described as extremely poor. In particular, many children struggle with the syntax of books, due in part to differences in the syntactical structures used in ASL, American Sign Language, versus written English. Thus, one of the things that we see with many deaf readers is low self-correction rates based on syntax in comparison to hearing students. Part of this is because American Sign Language does not use articles, including the, and. These differences affect the writing of deaf children who use ASL. In a writing sample collected by Trezic, a deaf child wrote the following: "You not wanted to, the mouse awful stink brought, bought hate, wouldn't people afraid, in people scream, in have mouse long tail, what number size, hate black, white, gray, my brother touch mouse, foot real, kill shoes, mouse die traps, fear mouse, many, 1, 2, 3, 4, bade kill wall." I am pretty good at reading first grade invented spellings, but this writing sample maps very differently onto written English, on the written English that is familiar to me, and I do not sign. Specifically, while the student generally produces accurate spelling, there's an inconsistent use of articles and a confusion of in and, the use of pronouns or named subjects, and word order that is not always consistent with written English. If I had a deaf child or a hearing impaired child in my classroom, I would have a lot to learn, and I would need to think carefully about the student's strengths and weaknesses in order to teach that child. Practicing phonemic awareness and phonics exercises might not be the best thing. Finally, there is one more consideration for signing children. In some cases, transferring printed English into sign can be challenging. For example, in American Sign Language, the signs for eat, apple, home, and yesterday are very similar. Thus, when a deaf reader is asked to read the English sentence, "I ate the apples at home yesterday," via signing, this is a relatively difficult task to process, given that the signs in translation are so similar in form. Research with deaf children has identified factors that complicate learning to read for deaf children, including syntactical differences between ASL and spoken English, children's abilities to hear and distinguish sounds, and challenges faced by children who are not raised by signing parents or do not bring rich language systems to classrooms. Children with other physical differences sometimes face other challenges. For example, Canuco explored the use of picture books designed for blind children that included tactile surfaces that were smooth and rough or fluffy, or included raised illustrative elements. He focused on children's hand movements that could be classified as searching, tracing, and their simultaneous use of two hands. Canuco surmised that these tactile interactions supported reading comprehension. Rodstaller and her authors in 2011 drew on the cases of 3 adults with mobility impairments, describing the technology that people found useful. These challenges are amplified for school children who are limited by the technologies available in their classrooms and their access to these same technologies at home. Returning to hearing impaired children like Lana, Gabrielle explained there is no single right way to teach deaf and hard of hearing children, and those approaches that privilege or retrofit sound-focused pathways may not just be irrelevant, but also harmful to deaf learners. As she warned, extending research conducted with hearing students to children whose hearing is limited is not only scientifically ungrounded, but also potentially dangerous to children who will be subjected to educational practices that will waste their learning time rather than serve their interests. Her point is not just about building a science of reading that addresses the needs and interests of deaf and hard of hearing children, but it's also about what we as reading scholars need to might learn if we understand how deaf and hard of hearing children learn to read and write. How is Lana learning to read? What are the things that are happening for her? While the example of deaf and hard of hearing children is particularly unsettling when we consider the science of reading, take a minute to consider what science of reading practices might need for kids who bring other physical differences. With coordination, what about holding books and using manipulatives and negotiating directionality or tracking words with a finger? What about mobility, coming to the carpet and sitting on the rug? What about eyesight, seeing text and tracking text? While children with profound difficulties often receive instruction in specialized schools, children with a range of physical differences from minimal to profound are in our classrooms, and we must adapt instruction for them. Neurological differences. While dyslexia is the most recognizing neurological difference within science of reading conversations, there are many other forms of neurological difference brought by children, including autism, spectrum disorders, and ADHD. These are not recognized within this publicized and politicized science of reading. James was diagnosed as a child with Asperger's when he was in grade 4. When he was younger, he often argued with the other children and got in trouble with his teachers for not following the directions, sitting quietly, or getting along with others. His assignments were rarely complete, and sitting still and focusing on activities that he saw as meaningless was particularly difficult. When the other children came to the carpet for phonics and phonemic awareness practice, James was required to stay in his seat and finish the work he hadn't completed. However, James often co-opted classroom time for his own purposes. He read Captain Underpants books, created imaginative stories about angry birds, and wrote about confused fortune cookies who failed to produce predictions. James was one of the best readers in his class, but found participating in skill and drill activities intolerable. Forcing him to participate resulted in misbehaviors, frustration, and his growing dislike of school. Researchers have documented challenges faced by many children who bring neurological differences. Taylor described the experiences faced by a child with ADHD and the challenges his family faced in negotiating the school as he was tested for special education services. Similarly, Rogers applied discourse analysis to the transcript of a special education referral meeting in which the expert views were privileged over the voices of the child's parents. Finally, Shalaby presents the case of a charming and clever student who struggled to adapt to the expectations of his classroom. In all three cases, as for James, whose neurodiversity was not related to dyslexia, instead of merely skill and drill with phonics and phonemic awareness, these differences require different types of accommodations and different types of support. While children with neurological differences are sometimes educated in specially designed rooms and designated classrooms, James and many other children are in regular classrooms. And many of these children are not dyslexic, and the routinized, meaningless skill and drill of science of reading programs designed for dyslexic children are antithetical to the types of instruction that would benefit these children. As Milner reported, science of reading efforts are complicated when the field situates its challenges in learning to read through a particular special education lens. These framings fail to or refuse to recognize the language and literacy assets, strengths, skills, dispositions, mindsets, and practices of children whose neurological differences are not related to dyslexia. Human differences. Liz does not have a name difference, and she does not receive ELL services, although she is biracial. She speaks Korean and English. Liz loves sports and excels in basketball and track. She's pictured herself as a 2018 Ninja Warrior with a hedgehog in one hand while dribbling a basketball with the other. In large letters, she wrote NBA at the bottom of her page, and in small print, ironically writes, "No boys allowed." Liz and all of her peers is a magnificent and unique mix of a million different dimensions. Liz just begins to represent the vast range of human differences which all children bring to literacy learning. Raised alongside her two brothers, but unlike her siblings, she exceeds in school. Liz helps her mother at home with the family garden while balancing a complicated schedule of team practices and school responsibilities. Rarely speaking up in class, Liz pays close attention and takes careful notes. While she's well-behaved and diligent, her real joy is sport. As she writes, "The thing I like about school is recess. I like to play tetherball, kickball, and after school we play soccer." The entire Bailey School Kids book series is displayed on her bedroom shelf. While these differences make Liz special, they are also ubiquitous. All children are different in remarkable and amazing ways. While many scholars have described the many ways in which children are unique and amazing, Mari Clay has been a leader in recognizing the differences that all children, including normally progressing children, bring to learning to read. Writing in 1982, Mari Clay reminded us that children inform our instructional efforts by showing us what they know and what they partially control and what they're not yet attending to. In literacy lessons designed for individuals, Clay, written 23 years after her early writing in 1982, Clay reiterated this commitment to children. She dedicated an entire page to the following. "And in the end, it is the individual adaptation made by the expert teacher and the child's idiosyncratic competencies and the history of past experiences that start him on an upward climb to effective literacy performances." Mari Clay's interest in the unique abilities and propensities of children was perhaps best captured in one of her least known books, Quadruplets and Higher Multiple Births, published in 1989. In this book, Clay brought together what is known from historical records and reports in the medical, psychological, and popular press. Perhaps most interesting to us is her longitudinal report on the Auckland quadruplets, whom she followed for 6 years. Among the data she reported on for these quads and others were the different times when children learned to sit up, pull themselves up, and walk, In the case of the quintuplets depicted here, differences of 4 months were not unusual for when toddlers took their first steps. Clay herself documented differences in children's abilities to draw a circle at age 3 and copy an image at age 7. These are her quadruplet data. She documented their directionality with text as they entered school and tracked their reading behaviors over time. She ranked their test scores from ages 6 to 12, noting that children shifted and when their reading accelerated and paused. Research with twins and other multiple births is particularly significant as we consider human diversity. While children who are twins, triplets, or quadruplets are born at different weights and sometimes with particular health concerns, they share the same genes in the same environment, helping us to better understand that even with important similarities, all children are different. All of us who have siblings or multiple children of our own know that children in our families are different, and that these differences sometimes affect learning to read and write. Some may say that my examples are problematic, and that some of the children I describe may not be served in general education or intervention classrooms, or they'll have specialists who work with them on learning to read. However, in many cases, especially those related to racial, cultural, and linguistic differences, many children bring differences to our classrooms. In the case of neurodiversity, the young readers are often not diagnosed and provided with special education services at the time that they're first learning to read. In addition, while totally blind or deaf children are often educated in specialized schools, children with less profound differences are in our general education classrooms and our intervention programs, and they must be served. Others may note that the research I draw on is not comprehensive. This is true. My goal is to offer a corrective to narrow and incomplete descriptions of the science of reading that present exaggerated, misleading, and at worst false claims promoted by the media and by a small group of scholars and educational activists, publishers, and journalists. I am not dismissing research on how children learn to decode or quantitative studies that document the effects of reading interventions. My claim is that the studies I reference here in this presentation exist, and that these studies are systematic, detailed, and that their claims are based on data. Most are case studies that tell the stories of children we teach, of the children that we teach. These studies and these children matter. Narrow policies, practices, and claims are dangerous because they deny the diversity of children served in North American classrooms. As an active scholar who closely follows discussions of the science of reading, I worry when people suggest that the science of reading must reconcile itself with diversity or just add a bit more to the issues of equity, a bit more attention to issues of equity. While adding attention to differences to the science of reading might be possible, it will require fundamental changes to claims espoused by the science of reading. And the following claims, for example, the following claims must be questioned. Heavy doses of phonics and phonemic awareness are universally appropriate for all children. Scripted curriculum is appropriate. Narrow instruction mandates from districts and state education departments are valid. And educators should value fidelity over flexibility. While many science of reading advocates claim to support wiggle room or some degree of differentiation, the ways the science of reading is often implemented in schools and classrooms does not allow these deviations from mandated practices and is often scripted. Thus, these claims are false and antithetical to child-centered instruction. The science of reading is not settled, mostly due to human diversity. People are different, children are different, languages and notational systems are different. Trajectories are different for children who speak different languages. There is no one trajectory that defines the instance of human development from learning to speak to becoming elderly. While trajectories are inevitably marked by cultural, linguistic, and experiential differences, they are always unique and personal, even among members of the same socioeconomic level, race, culture, or family. If it were just phonics, the children served in reading first classrooms would have become skillful readers who could decode and comprehend at rates beyond children in other programs. This was not the case. Johnson and Scanlon agreed that the problem lies in instruction not accommodating the students' unique complexities. They advocated for a thorough analysis of instructional interactions between children and their teachers, with attention to the unique backgrounds, opportunities, knowledges, and interests that children bring to classrooms. When science of reading advocates blame teachers for reading failure within underserved communities, they shift the lens of research and public concern away from historical and contemporary inequities income differences, housing, nutrition, educational opportunities, relieving politicians and policymakers in larger society from fiscal and humanitarian obligations. However, a more nefarious inclination may underlie science of reading arguments. Alongside recent efforts to silence discussions of critical race theory, the obliteration of DEI, deporting immigrants, and banning books, the science of reading directs our attention away from inequities. As Ian Grova noted, instead of providing financial or social support for impoverished families and communities, legislators discuss literacy reform as a means of ensuring that those who come from historically underserved communities could, quote, take care of themselves, find employment, and move out of poverty. In the chain of science of reading signifiers, explicit phonics instruction becomes a substitution for investing in communities and creating the safety nets that were necessary for families to climb out of poverty. Equality in reading classrooms means providing all children with the same in curriculum and activities, regardless of their abilities or other differences. Equity in reading classrooms means that all children are provided with resources and experiences specific to their abilities and goals. Honoring the difference that children bring to classrooms is not about tweaking a set of universally mandated practices. Human difference is an inconvenient truth, and our job is to teach children, not programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Compton-Lilly. Go ahead, Tracy.
Nope,
Nope.
I'm good.
Nope, you go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you as well while you were logging on. Thank you, Kathy.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
We do have time to take questions from our audience. If you have them, go ahead and put them in the chat. Yes, if you're registered, I will send out a recording of tonight's presentation. And Tracy put a link to this PowerPoint as well.
And there is a question in the directly to the panelists.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the best ways that we, educators and scholars, can advocate for the diversity of learners?
That's a big question, but a really, really important one. I think there's a couple things. I think one of the things that we have to do as a field, and here I'm thinking about university folks, is we really need to tell the stories of what's happening in science of reading classrooms and, document the kinds of practices that most parents probably would not want for their children. And here I'm thinking about kids sitting in circles and doing phonemic awareness for, 45 minutes a day, those kind of things, even when that is not what the National Reading Panel report recommended. So I think one way is to, challenge those practices and to let people know. One of the big things that happened back in the 1970s is a researcher named Rist. He came up with a statistic through his research that kids were only reading for an average of 7 minutes a day. And that particular statistic, even though it was taken out of context and shared broadly, I think that particular statistic made people think. Even people who didn't have a strong background in reading, they knew that kids needed to read for more than 7 minutes a day. So I think, there may be some key things that we can take away from our understanding of what's happening in classrooms that will make people rethink some of the things that they're hoping for. That's one way to think about it. The biggest thing that I would say to teachers, though, which I think is more your question, and that is to put the child in the center. Whatever we're doing has to be about the kids that are in front of us. Informative research, listening to kids read, miscue analysis, running records. When they're analyzed correctly, they can truly be used in informative ways to help children. So, we're doing a lot of focus on data, right? Schools are focusing on data, but they're looking at one number, like they get a score for comprehension. What does that tell you? I mean, that comprehension score could represent all different kinds of things that, can go anything from not being an active reader as they're reading to not decoding to, trying so hard to be getting all the words right. So there's so many different things that be going on when, we look at that summative data and we look at those numbers that represent huge chunks of stuff. So, trying to focus on children, And when we get pushback from administrators, if we have formative data that says, look, this is what this child's doing, this is what he can do, these are the things that we need to help him to master, when we actually go with that formative data, I think it's hard for them to tell us we can't do those sorts of things. And we can always show that data to the parents. And I think that can help them get on our side as well. So those are my beginnings of answers to those kind of questions.
Thank you. Another question from Helen is, what literacy practices would you say are the most important for teachers to embrace and promote, as I self-correct?
Of course, it depends on the child. So different kids are going to need different things. So again, going back to real close observation, the kid watching that Yetta Goodman introduced us to, really paying attention to what kids do or don't do with text, and designing instruction to go in those directions. But I think once you get beyond basic levels of reading and they have some fluency, is finding books that they love, letting them read things that they're passionate about and things that represent who they are. And I don't know if this is going to be a popular opinion, but I think series books are great because they have very similar plots. They have the same characters. Once you've read one, you can just go through that whole series. But think of how many words that kid is reading. So I'm a big advocate of finding, a set of books that kids, buy into. And sometimes it'll go across the class. So, all the kids want to read the Wimpy, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or, Boxcar books, or whatever the books are that are popular. But I think getting them into those series books can really make a big difference. We got to get them reading.
We as adults do that, don't we? We
Of
find an author
course.
we like and stick with it. Kylene Beers, I heard her say in a webinar once that children who read series become lifelong readers because they get that love of wanting to know and going forward. So it's an important point that you've made. Hannah asks, how do we address scripted programs that claim to be based on science of reading when it includes such egregious practices against what we know as best practice?
That's hard because unfortunately, people aren't always willing to look at the actual research or to think about it. I often send district people to What Works Clearinghouse, not because I think that it's the be all and end all of, what programs work, but most of these, I may even say all of these, most of these programs associated with the science of reading are either not on there at all, have no studies that show effectiveness, or if they do, it's marginal, or some of them have negative effectiveness. So I believe there's one study on there for letters training that actually had negative outcomes. But, so trying to get them to at least, recognize that, the research that is being claimed is not there. So, that's one way to do it. But I think that's really tough because, I use this analogy with my students. It seems like people have drank the Kool-Aid, they just buy into things without a clear understanding. And, unfortunately, we see this not just in reading instruction, but, we've got the vaccination issues, we've got all kinds of, nonsensical things that people are believing out there. So I don't have a really good answer for that other than just keep plugging away and, being as much of an expert as you can to be able to answer their questions and to be able to say, hey, well, actually, there's research that shows.
Mm-hmm. Well, as long as What Works Clearinghouse is there, we can still resource it. So a
True.
couple of questions do go along with this current educational climate. And with the repression of words like diversity, equity, inclusion, what are some venues that we can tell stories that will be heard when they need to be heard most?
I would like to say that this is what our professional organization should be and should be doing. And I think we need to continue to remind our professional organizations of their responsibility. And I think some are doing this better than others. So, that's one thing that supposedly we should be able to turn to. One of the things, I've been doing a historical review of reading instruction. And in 1955, when Flesch produced Why Johnny Can't Read, what was then IRA, the International Reading Association, they got researchers together across the country to work on trying to show that, to do a research study across the country that would compare different models of reading. And it became the largest reading study ever done. And I don't know if it's possible, but it'd be amazing to do a parallel study across different sites and to look at, maybe we look at something like we go into classrooms in a willing school that has to do with the science of reading and document what's actually happening. Maybe it's that we interview parents whose kids have been in these programs and no longer like reading. Maybe it's that we analyze some of these programs, get our hands on some of these materials and actually show parents what their kids are being asked to do. You know, so I think there's one of the possibilities just to create some kind of large scale project where we'd be doing some things in different places and then pulling those findings together to some kind of national report. But, you know, I'm frustrated too.
Yeah.
I wish I had great answers to all these questions.
Well, they're big questions, so there's never going to be an answer for everything, anything. We're always going to have ideas and not answers. Janice asked the question, states and then asked the question, many justice-centered organizations such as NAACP are advocating for SOR practices due to the very large racial disparities in reading achievement scores, particularly for African American students. Have you found any talking points effective for helping these and other justice-focused organizations understand the nuances around reading instruction and achievement?
No, but Janice, I think you're pointing to a really important point is that, you know, I don't know if anyone's sat down with people from those organizations and said, you know, here's what we know, you know, here's the limits of this science of reading. And we don't have to, you know, villainize it or villainize the people behind it, but we need to talk about the gaps that aren't there. So, you know, it seems to me that, you know, professional organizations again, or maybe even groups of professionals should be sitting down and talking to folks and trying to set them straight on, you know, this is not mainstream literacy research. This is a very different kind of approach. So, yeah, I don't know if we've had conversations with them directly challenging some of the things. You know, when I see Lamar Burton, you know, advocating science of reading, I just want to cry because reading Rainbow, you know, but
Same.
it's hard.
There are lots of thank yous and people pointing out there's a lot of food for thought from what you shared tonight. So I know when they go back to the slide, they'll have more to consider as they're able to take it all in a little bit more. One person, Sharon, shared that she has talked to some advocates at NAACP, but it
Good.
just needs to be done more.
Yeah, yeah. Just one note, this paper is coming out in the Reading Recovery Journal. It should be out in the next couple months, so stay posted for that.
Okay, I'm looking through for any more questions. And not see anyone, but lots of thank yous. Andy, I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right. Again, I thank you all for coming here tonight. We have a teacher panel coming up on April 15th, and I'll be sending out reminders for that. It's important that we hear the stories of teachers and that they tell the stories of their students. We need to hear the stories. So please join us on April 15th. Other than that, we share a passion for making the world a better place. Literacy is a social justice issue. We will continue the fight. So thank you, Kathy and everyone. Good night, people. I will send you a recording of this if you are a registered person. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.